The order came down on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Cruelty, in Marin Voss's experience, preferred Fridays. It liked the weekend buffer. It liked the way a Friday ruling gave the paperwork time to cool before anyone had to look the subject in the eye. But it was Tuesday, and the order was real, and it sat on her desk in the administrative module of Outpost Verath like a stone someone had placed very carefully in the center of a table. Subject: Orc refugee, classification review. Status: non-compliant, relocation required within 48 hours. Authorized by Director Aldrich San, Colonial Resources Division. Marin read it twice. She folded it once, along the crease it already had, and set it down. Through the window, real glass, a luxury she'd never asked for and received anyway as part of the director's grade module, she could see the camp spread below the ridge. 47 structures, none of them meant to be permanent, all of them past their third year. The morning fog was still low over the valley, and in it the shelters looked like stones half submerged in a gray river. She had looked at that view so many times it had stopped registering as suffering. That was the first thing they trained out of you in colonial administration. Not cruelty, just the registration of it. Her name was Keth. That was the part that made the order feel different. Not the Orc refugee or Subject 7 Keth, the way the initial intake forms had labeled her. Just Keth. Marin had learned it from Davo, her deputy, who had learned it from the camp's medical liaison, who had learned it from Keth herself during the intake physical, when the woman had pressed 2 fingers to her own sternum and said the words so quietly it barely carried. The Orc woman had arrived 11 days ago alone on foot, through the eastern pass that no one used because the pass was theoretically impassable. She had 3 broken ribs from a fall she would not describe, a burn across her left forearm that had been dressed by someone who knew what they were doing and nothing else. No documentation, no coalition paperwork, no translator chip. She had walked out of the fog at 400 and stood at the camp perimeter without touching the wire and waited. That was the part that had bothered Director San's office. Not the injuries, the waiting, the self-possession of it, the fact that she had not begged or charged or collapsed. She had stood there, enormous and still, and waited for a human to decide what to do, and that, apparently, read as threatening in the relocation matrix. Marin picked up her comm. Davo. Already read it, he said. Where is she? Medical hold Bay 4. They won't discharge her for another 2 days minimum. The ribs aren't set enough to travel. A pause. Director San's office is aware of that. Of course they are. She stood. Get me Coordinator Hollies at the Relief Bureau and pull Keth's full intake file. Everything. I want it on my desk before the morning briefing. Marin. His voice had that careful flatness it got when he was about to say something she didn't want to hear. The order has a compliance window if we delay past the 48 hours. I know what the compliance window is. She clicked the comm off and looked out at the fog again. The thing about Aldrich San was that he was not a monster. Marin had worked for monsters earlier in her career before she'd understood the landscape well enough to navigate around them. San was something different and in some ways more exhausting. He was a man of systems. He believed in the matrix. He believed the forms existed for a reason, that the classifications protected the colony, that sentimentality was the enemy of function. He would have read the Keth file and seen a liability column with nothing in the asset column, and he would have signed the order with the same clean signature he put on supply requests. The cruelty wasn't in San, the cruelty was in the column. Marin was halfway to the medical bay when her comm buzzed again. An alert from the perimeter sensors, low priority, the kind that flagged atmospheric anomalies. She almost ignored it. She had been almost ignoring perimeter anomalies for 3 years because the eastern sensor array had a calibration fault that periodically read passing cloud banks as unregistered thermal signatures. But the alert was coming from inside the perimeter, inside the administrative module. She stopped walking. The second alert came 4 seconds later, from inside her office. She turned around. The thing in her office was not small. That was the first impression, size, and then the absence of sound, because something that large should have displaced more air, should have created the small physical pressure of presence that large bodies made in enclosed spaces. It didn't. It sat in the chair across from her desk, her chair actually, which it had apparently relocated without touching anything else, and it had the approximate shape of something bipedal, but the details were wrong in ways her eyes kept failing to resolve. Not alien in the way the orc woman was alien, familiar, biological, and comprehensible once you adjusted your register. Wrong in a different direction. Wrong like a word you've read so many times it stops looking like a word. It turned toward her. "Director Voss," it said. The voice came from somewhere other than where a mouth should have been. "I have been watching your outpost for some time." Marin did not reach for the emergency beacon on her wrist. Later, she would not be able to explain why, except that something in the quality of its attention didn't feel predatory. It felt like being studied by something very patient. "Who are you?" she said. "Not a question, a position." "I am a messenger," it said. "That is the closest word. My function is to deliver a particular kind of information to particular kinds of people at particular kinds of moments." It inclined its head, something that might have been a gesture of courtesy. "You are at a particular kind of moment, Director. If this is about the relocation order." "It is about the relocation order," it said, "and about you, primarily about you." It stood, and the wrongness of its proportions became briefly more apparent before she adjusted, the way eyes adjust to a new light level. "I would like to show you some things. You have approximately 4 hours before the briefing. That is enough time." "I'm not going anywhere with." "You won't go anywhere," it said. "You'll stay precisely where you are. It is the things that will come to you." She woke up at her desk. She was certain she had not sat down. She was equally certain of the time, 6:11, the same as when she had walked back into the office, and yet she felt the cellular weight of someone who had been awake for 36 hours. The fog outside the window was the same fog. Nothing had moved. But she remembered everything. She remembered the camp from below, from inside, from the perspective of someone who slept in one of the 47 structures. The cold that came through the walls at night, not because the structures were poorly built, but because they were built for temporary occupation, and it had been 3 years. The sound of the camp at 300, which was not silence. It was the particular held-breath non-silence of people who had learned that making noise at night could attract the wrong kind of attention. The way the children had learned to cry quietly. She had not known the children had learned to cry quietly. She had been looking at intake numbers. She remembered the medical bay from the perspective of a patient in Bay 4, lying on her back with 3 broken ribs and a burned forearm, and the particular dignity of someone who has survived a great deal and is not going to perform distress for an audience. She remembered, and she was not certain whether this was the messenger's doing or her own finally honest memory. The face of the intake officer who had processed Keth's arrival, the slight pursing of lips that wasn't cruelty, just bureaucratic fatigue, and how it had registered on a face that had crossed a mountain range alone. She remembered the moment the relocation order had been transmitted to Davos Terminal. She remembered it from the angle of a man who had served on Outpost Verath for 5 years, and who had learned, in that time, to keep his face completely still when he was reading something that made him want to quit. She remembered what the messenger had shown her at the end, just before she came back to herself, the Eastern Pass, not in daylight but in the deep night when Keth had made her crossing. The drop she had fallen on was 40 meters. There were handholds in the rock face below the drop point, natural ones, where she had climbed back out. The handholds were dark with what had dried there. Marin sat at her desk for a long time with her hands flat on the surface. The briefing was at 800. She had 2 hours. She picked up the folded order. She unfolded it. She read it a third time slowly, the way you read something when you are looking for the exact location of the lie. It was not in any single word. It was in the space between non-compliant and relocation. The assumption contained in that phrasing, the bureaucratic grammar that turned a person into a logistics problem. She had written that grammar herself in other documents dozens of times, and she had not heard it until now. She put the order down. "Davo," she said into the comm. "It's not 800 yet." "I know. Pull me the specifications for the modular annexation units in Storage Bay 3. The insulated ones, not the temporary shelters. And get me Holt from engineering." A pause. "What for?" "I'm going to need to know what we can build in 8 hours." The pause was longer this time. "Marin, the compliance window runs out in 40 hours, I'm aware." She stood up and moved to the window. Below, the fog was beginning to lift, and the camp was resolving out of gray into its ordinary colors. The brown of the structures, the worn paths between them, the small bright squares where someone had hung something to dry. "So we have 40 hours. What can we build in 8? She heard him exhale slowly. Then she heard him pull up a terminal. "The modular annexation units are rated for permanent installation," he said. 12-centimeter insulation, double-pane environmental seals, rated to local winter standards. A pause as he scrolled. "We have 4 in storage." They were earmarked for the facility expansion in Q3. "What's the Q3 timeline?" 7 months out. "So they're available." "Marin, what can we build in 8 hours? Another long breath. One full room, properly done with the environmental seals and the interior fitting. 10 by 12. It'd have to tie into the camp's existing utility trunk, which means getting Holt to run a new branch line, which is 2 hours of work minimum. He paused. "It would be a real room, not a shelter. Medical-grade environmental controls. It would be better than what most of the permanent staff have." "Good," she said. "Marin, San's office is going to." "I know what San's office is going to do," she said. "Schedule the morning briefing for 900 instead of 800. I need an hour with the engineering team first. And Davo, don't brief anyone on what we're doing until we've started. Once the foundation anchors are in the ground, it's a facility modification on record, and pulling the order gets complicated." A very long pause. "You planned this already," he said. "I'm planning it now." "You're going to file it as a facility modification." "I'm going to file it as a facility modification." She heard what might have been a laugh quickly suppressed. "I'll get Holt." Holt arrived at 6:40 with 2 members of his engineering team, both of whom were young enough that the request seemed exciting rather than politically fraught. Marin walked them through the site herself, a cleared flat area at the camp's eastern edge, close enough to the main utility trunk to make the branch line practical, far enough from the perimeter fence to feel interior, protected. She had chosen it by instinct, and then confirmed it by walking the space and standing in the middle of it, and asking herself whether, if she had crossed a mountain range alone with 3 broken ribs, this was the place where she could feel that the crossing had been worth it. She thought it was. "Foundation anchors first," she told Holt. "I want them in before the camp wakes up." He looked at her steadily. He was 42, ex-military construction, had built half of Outpost Verath's infrastructure in the first year of occupation. He had a particular quality of competence that expressed itself as an unwillingness to be surprised. "How fast do you need the whole thing?" 8 hours. He calculated something visibly. "We can do it in 6 if I pull Renner from the maintenance rotation." "Pull Renner?" He nodded once and turned to his team, and the ordinary miracle of people who knew what they were doing began. Marin went to the medical bay. Keth was awake. She was always awake when Marin came, which Marin suspected had less to do with coincidence and more to do with Keth's particular quality of vigilance. the sense that she processed information about her environment very completely and was rarely caught unprepared. She lay with her hands folded over the thin blanket, her enormous frame making the medical bay furniture look like something from a children's facility, and she turned her head when Marin came through the door with an expression that was not hope, and was not fear, and was something Marin had no precise human word for. They had been managing on shared vocabulary, the two of them, over the 11 days. Marin spoke 3 coalition dialects, none of which were Keth's primary language, and Keth had approximately 40 words of Terran Standard, most of them operational nouns. It was enough for functional exchange. It was not enough for the conversation Marin wanted to have. She sat in the chair beside the bed, which she had never done before. She had always stood in previous visits, the administrator posture of someone conducting a welfare check. She sat down. Keth watched her. "I received an order," Marin said. She spoke slowly, the way she had learned to with Keth, not louder, just more deliberate, giving the words time to map onto whatever internal translation process Keth was running. "The order says you have to leave the outpost." The orc woman said nothing. Her expression didn't change, but something in the quality of her stillness shifted, a fraction. "I'm not going to follow that order," Marin said. A very long pause. "You will trouble," Keth said. Her Terran Standard was careful, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. "Yes," Marin said. "I will trouble." Something moved through Keth's face that Marin couldn't read, not quite. It was not relief. It was something more complicated than relief, something that had earned the right to be complicated. She had been here 11 days. She had been a file, a case number, a compliance problem. The fact that she had also been, every one of those days, a person who had climbed back out of a 40-meter fall that had been administrative background noise. "Why?" Keth said. Marin thought about the messenger. She thought about the camp in the fog, seen from inside. She thought about children who had learned to cry quietly and a deputy's carefully still face, and the worn dark stone below a mountain handhold. "Because it's the right thing," she said, "and I forgot that for a while. And I remembered." She stood up. "They're building you a room," she said, "a real one with heat." She went back to the construction site. Holt had the foundation anchors in, and the first modular wall panel going up by the time she returned. The engineering team worked with a focused efficiency that was something to watch, Renner running the utility conduit, while Holt and his 2 young colleagues fitted the wall panels in the precise sequence the modular system required, each piece interlocking with the next in a way that was obvious once you saw it, and elegant in the way that only practical things were elegant. No wasted motion. No theater. Just humans who understood a system working the system. Marin got her hands dirty. She was not an engineer, but she had grown up on a working station, and she knew how to follow instruction and where to position her body so she was useful rather than in the way. Holt handed her a sealing tool without comment, and she ran beads along panel joints while he checked the environmental connections. Her hands found the rhythm of it. She had not done physical work in, she calculated and stopped calculating, because the number was too large and too sad. Davo appeared at 8:45 with 2 cups of coffee, and the expression of a man who had made a decision. He was not going to revisit. He handed her a cup without a word. She took it. They stood for a moment looking at the half-built room, the walls up now, the roof panels going on, the utility conduit snaking across the cleared ground to tie into the camp's main trunk. It looked, even incomplete, like something that intended to be here, like something that had decided. "San is going to call," Davo said. "I know. What do you want me to tell him?" She drank some of the coffee. It was terrible. The camp's supply always was, recycled and re-recycled until it tasted like the memory of coffee rather than coffee itself. And it was also exactly right. "Tell him I'm conducting a facility modification," she said. "Tell him I'll have a full report for him after the briefing. Tell him," she paused, Tell him the relocation window hasn't elapsed." "It hasn't." "No, it hasn't." She looked at the room. "By the time it does, she'll have a residence on record, permanent facility resident. That's a different classification entirely." Davo was quiet for a moment. "That's a very creative reading of the colonial housing code." "It's an accurate reading of the colonial housing code. San's legal team is going to find that an interesting position." "San's legal team is going to find it a complicated position," Marin said. "Which is different. Complicated means time. Time means appeal. Appeal means Keth stays in a room with heat while we have the argument." She looked at him. "Which argument would you rather have?" He was quiet again. "Then I would rather have the argument where she's already in the room." "So would I." She handed him back the empty cup and went back to work. The roof sealed at 11:30. The environmental systems came online at 12:15, and Holt ran the diagnostic twice before he was satisfied. The interior was bare. The modular units came with standard fittings, a bed frame and a work surface and shelving, and the camp supply officer had come down to the site at some point in the late morning and left a folded blanket and 2 additional sets of linens without making eye contact with anyone, which Marin chose to interpret as solidarity. The room had windows, 2 of them real ones looking east toward the pass. She had not specified that. Holt had made that choice, or his team had, or the modular unit had come configured that way. It didn't matter. The windows looked east, and in the late afternoon the light through them would fall directly and warm. Marin stood in the doorway. It was a room, not a shelter, not a module, not a temporary facility. A room, the way a room was when someone had made choices about it. The environmental seal held the interior temperature 15 degrees above the camp standard. The bed was against the wall with the better light. The shelving was at a height that would be practical for someone of Keth's dimensions. She felt something she had not felt in. She calculated again and stopped again. She had a memory, from the messenger's long cold tour through her own outpost, of standing outside this exact space, or a version of it, and seeing it unbuilt. Seeing the flat cleared earth and the possibility of a room and the choice between building it and not building it. The messenger had not told her what to choose. It had just stood in the cold and shown her the difference between the 2 versions of the morning, and then it had given her back to herself, to choose. She had chosen this one. The discharge from medical came through at 1400, conditional on the availability of appropriate housing, which was now a matter of record. Marin walked to the medical bay herself, which was not required by any protocol and was entirely required by her understanding of what the morning had been. Keth walked out of the medical bay under her own power, moving carefully around the healing ribs, and she stopped in the doorway where the facility interior opened onto the camp's central path. She had not been outside since her arrival. She stood for a moment in the outdoor air, which was cold and thin and smelled of the valley, and she looked at the sky, which was the pale late afternoon blue of this particular latitude. She looked up for a long time. Marin waited. Then Keth looked down and across the camp to where the new room stood at the eastern edge, visible from here, its windows catching the afternoon light. She said something in her own language. Marin didn't have the vocabulary for it, but she had enough to hear that it was not a question. They walked to the room together. At the door, Keth stopped and looked at Marin for a long time with the expression that Marin still didn't have a precise word for, the one that had been on her face in the medical bay when Marin had said the word "why" and the word "right." Up close, Keth was larger than the medical bay had made her seem, and older, with the particular kind of age that came from hard use rather than years. The burn on her forearm was healing cleanly. Her eyes, which were dark and very clear, held the quality that Marin had been trying to name for 11 days and finally placed now. They were the eyes of someone who had expected very little from this place and was recalibrating. Keth pressed 2 fingers to her own sternum, the way she had in the intake physical. "Keth," she said. Then she moved her hand and pressed 2 fingers gently to Marin's sternum. She waited. Marin said. Keth nodded once and went into the room. The comm buzzed at 1600. Director San's office, as predicted. Marin took the call in the administrative module with the door open, which was not incidental. She had arranged the documents on her desk with care. The facility modification filing, the updated residential registry, the colonial housing code section she had cited, and underneath all of it, the original relocation order, its single fold still sharp. She answered. San himself was on the line, which meant his office had already read the filing and found the interpretation she had intended them to find. He had the voice of a man of systems encountering a spanner in the works and choosing, for the moment, to sound reasonable about it. "Marin," he said, "we need to talk about the Keth matter." "Of course, Director." The classification review was clear. Non-compliant status under the current refugee intake protocols. "I understand the classification," she said. "I've filed a facility modification that changes the applicable housing category before the relocation window closes. Section 14C of the Colonial Housing Code is unambiguous on the priority of established residential status." A pause. "That's a creative reading." "It's an accurate reading. I'm happy to schedule a legal review if you'd like one." Marin, his voice shifted just fractionally into something more direct. "This is going to create complications. The classification matrix exists for—" "I know what it exists for," she said. "I've been running it for 3 years." "Then you know why we need—" "I know why we use the words we use," she said. "Non-compliant, relocation required, case closed. I know what those words are for, Director. They're for making the column work out." She kept her voice level. "I also know that a human being walked across a mountain range that nobody walks across alone with 3 broken ribs and stood at a wire without touching it and waited for us to decide what she was to us. And I've decided." The silence on the line had a particular quality, not the silence of a man preparing to escalate. The silence of a man who was, somewhere under the systems, still capable of a different kind of calculation. "The legal review will take time," he said finally. "I know. During which she's a permanent facility resident, and the relocation order is superseded by the housing code." "Yes." Another silence. "You've thought this through," he said. "I have. The review board convenes in 6 weeks. I'll have a full documentation package for them." The line was quiet for a moment longer. Then, "Submit the facility modification formally by end of day. Make sure it's clean." "It's already filed." "A beat." "Of course it is." Something in his voice shifted fractionally, not warmth exactly, but the sound of a man of systems encountering something that was using the system correctly and not being entirely certain what to do with that. "Marin, for what it's worth, the matrix isn't designed to be cruel." "I know, Director," she said, "but it can be when no one's paying attention to the space between the words." She clicked off. Davo was in the doorway, leaning against the frame with the careful casualness of someone who had definitely been listening. He had a second cup of terrible coffee in his hand, which he held out. She took it. "How did he take it?" Davo asked. "He took it like someone who's going to spend 6 weeks reading the colonial housing code and not finding a way to undo it." "That's a yes, then." "That's a yes." She drank. "Get the briefing notes to the full staff. I want everyone to understand the facility modification filing and the residential classification. If anyone has questions, they come to me, not to San's office." "Done." He didn't move immediately. "For what it's worth," he said, not quite looking at her, "I would have quit if the order had gone through. He stopped, tried again. "I had the resignation already drafted." She looked at him. I know, she said. Hell, because you're the kind of person who does things like that, she said. And because I was reading your face wrong for 3 years, and I'm done doing that. He nodded once slowly. He went to file the briefing. She stood at the window. Below, the camp had moved into its evening rhythm, the paths between the structures busy with the small traffics of communal life, the particular quality of light that fell on the valley at this hour making the whole spread of the place look, briefly, like somewhere that had meant to be here. The new room was visible at the eastern edge, its windows lit warm from inside. Marin watched it. She thought about the messenger, which had come from somewhere she couldn't locate on any map she possessed, and which had sat in her chair and shown her the difference between 2 mornings and left without telling her which one to choose. She wondered if it had known which one she would. She thought probably it had that part of its function, the particular information it delivered to particular people at particular moments, was the information of who you were when you remembered who you were. She had been running a column. She had been very good at running a column. The column balanced, and the camp functioned, and the people in the 47 structures that had never been meant to be permanent lived their careful, quiet lives at the edges of her mathematics, and she had made herself very good at not hearing that particular sound. She heard it now. There was work to do, documentation for the legal review, the facility modification package, a conversation with the camp's medical liaison about Keth's ongoing care, 100 administrative consequences of the choice she had made this morning. She would do it. She would do it with the same precision she had brought to running the column, and she would do it without asking anyone else to carry the weight of it. But first she stood at the window for a while longer in the last of the afternoon light, and watched the lit window at the eastern edge of camp, and thought about a woman who had climbed back out of a 40-meter fall in the dark, and then stood at a wire without touching it, and waited for someone to be human. She had been worth waiting for. Marin finished her coffee. The camp settled into night below her. Somewhere down in the structures, a child was crying, and the crying was not quiet. It was the full-voiced crying of a child who had stopped needing to muffle it, or maybe of a child who had never needed to in this particular corner of the camp, or maybe just of a child who was tired. It filled the cold air with the uncalculated, unstrategic, completely ordinary human fact of itself. It was the best thing she had heard all year. She went to write the documentation. Dawn came the way it always did on the valley, from the east, over the pass, the light arriving in flat horizontal lines that turned the frost on the structures briefly gold before it melted. Marin had worked through most of the night. The documentation package was complete, thorough, and formatted with the exactitude that she had learned over 3 years, produced the kind of paperwork that was very difficult to argue with. She was standing outside the administrative module with a cup of the terrible coffee when the door to the new room opened. Keth came out slowly, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose ribs were still making their opinion known, and she stood in the doorway of her room for a moment the way she had stood at the entry to the medical bay, adjusting to the outside air, recalibrating to the available light. She was wearing one of the medical bay's secondary blankets around her shoulders, and she looked out at the camp waking up around her, and at the eastern sky going from gray to pale gold. She looked like someone who had made a crossing. Marin lifted her cup. It was not a sophisticated gesture. It was not a speech. It was the thing you did when you were too tired for words and too glad for silence, and the person across the way needed to know that you saw them. Keth looked at her. She did the thing with her fingers again, 2 against her own sternum, then held out flat toward Marin an open hand. Marin had not seen that gesture before. She did not know what it meant in Keth's language, its full freight, its social weight, the exact tone of the original. She knew what it felt like. It felt like, I see you too. She held her cup toward the lit morning and let herself feel the weight of the long night in the small, warm room and the light coming over the pass where a woman had crossed alone, and she thought, this is the thing, this specific thing. The room, the coffee, the light, the open hand across the cold air. This is the thing the column cannot calculate and cannot contain and will never stop being worth more than the column. The camp was fully awake now, the paths moving, the early risers starting the communal cooking, a pair of the camp's children appearing from between two structures and stopping to look with frank curiosity at Keth in her doorway, and Keth looking back at them with an expression that was, Maren thought, very close to amusement. One of the children waved. Keth waved back. Maren drank her coffee. 40 hours had elapsed. The relocation window was closed. The room was on record. The legal review was 6 weeks away, and the documentation package was clean and thorough and very difficult to argue with. There would be more orders. She understood that. She had been in colonial administration long enough to know that the column always reasserted that San's legal team would find their angle, that this was not the end of the argument but the beginning of it, and the beginning of arguments was the best possible place to be, because at the beginning everything was still possible. She would fight it. She would fight it precisely and documentarily and through every channel available to her, and she would bring Davo and the camp staff and the medical liaison and the housing code and Section 14C and whatever else the fight required, and she would do it with the specific human stubbornness that had always been, in her experience, the most underestimated force in any known system. But that was the future. Right now, there was only the morning. The frost on the structures turning gold and then melting. The children in the path. The woman in her doorway, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the light coming over the pass. A room with 2 east-facing windows. Maren finished her coffee and went back inside to work.